Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm holding a copy of Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. They're going to show you the absolutely fabulous illustrations that come with this book and help tell the story. It's one of my favorite things. And I think actually Jason's going to share the screen, so you'll be able to see some of them. But I love the way that the illustrations advance the story and speak for one of the characters in a way that the character is unable to actually do for, well, I don't want to use the gender here. The character is unable to actually do. But one of the great things about Zoom is that we get to meet people, authors that we haven't previously met. And sometimes we get to pair them together as well, as we're doing tonight. So I'm entranced by Grady Hendrix, who is our guest host today. Grady, hi, very nice.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm entranced by his bibliography, so I'm just going to run through it real quickly to catch you all up. Dirt Candy, a cookbook. Why have I not read Dirt Candy, a cookbook? What an absolutely fabulous title. Does it have good recipes?
I don't know why you haven't read it, but I'm offended and hurt.
Sorry. Well, my husband is the cook, but it's sort of hard to resist. Then he wrote Horror Stir. Is it pronounced Horror Stir?
Horror Stir, Horror Store. I mean, you can go either way. Those umlauts can get tricky.
They can. All right, in 2014. And then he's better known today, I think, for the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and the Final Girls Support Group. And recently, or about to come out in 2023, actually, not even recently, How to Sell a Haunted House. Now, I'm assuming since it says Quirk Books after several of these titles, and Jason, I know, is an editor of Quirk Books, that is the thing that brought the two of you together.
Jason is the person who read a manuscript of mine that he really did not like at all, but he liked the writing. And then we did Horror Store together. My best friend's exorcism, paperbacks from hell, we sold our souls. And he started out doing Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and then moved on. But yeah, we've done a ton together and a lot of books with a huge visual component.
Yeah. And a lot of arguments.
Jason is the author of Impossible Fortress, which was nominated for an Edgar. And now here he is. Is this your second book? Am I right, Jason?
That's correct. Yes.
So what drove you from publishing into being an author? I mean, this seems like a reversal of the normal channel.
Well, I mean, I loved working in publishing. I loved working with authors like Grady on these really cool projects that were very visual. What happened was my life just got kind of busy. I had sold Impossible Fortress and I had a chance to adapt the script. And that was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back. I had always wanted to write a screenplay. I was going to get paid for it. It was with Netflix. And after writing like late at night and early in the morning for 20 years while balancing a full-time job, I was finally like, okay, I'm going to take the plunge. I'm going to do it. I'm going to leave my day job. I'm going to try to, just invest all my energy into this and make a go of it. And so then, of course, Netflix didn't make the movie.
Yeah, but sheer terror can be a real motivating factor, can't it?
Well, it sure did. It sure did. So I was like, all right, I got to do something else. And I mean, Grady and I will get into this later, but we did work on all these projects that were design intensive. So when I started thinking about what my next book would be, the one thing I knew was I wanted it to be collaborative because I like being able to interact with people and not just being alone in my house all day, alone in my brain. And I thought it'd be really fun to do a mystery where there were clues that were illustrations, because a lot of my favorite books when I was a kid were like that. But since I wanted this to be a book for adults, I knew that they couldn't be like decorative illustrations. They had to sort of be part of the world of the story. And when we get into it later, I'll show some examples of what I mean. But that was the impetus, to do some kind of illustrated mystery thriller. And that was the starting point.
Well, since Grady is the guest host, I guess I'll just sit here and be decorative for a little while and turn it over to Grady.
Well, I wanted to ask, so I don't know, Jason, you probably want to give like a quick log line for Hidden Pictures before we start talking about it, so people aren't like, what the hell are they talking about?
Sure. Yeah, so it is, it's kind of like a contemporary spin on The Turn of the Screw. It's about a babysitter. She's from South Philly. Her name is Mallory. And as the story opens, she takes a job in this very beautiful bucolic suburb as a nanny to a 5-year-old boy named Teddy. And Teddy loves to draw. And maybe I should just share my screen. Maybe I should sort of give an example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, because that thing you wanted to show, I think, is pretty hot. So yeah. Also, by the way, it's good to see you. It's been a while.
You too, Grady. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. And you know, I'll just give an example. I think she goes to her job interview, and this little boy Teddy is drawing constantly, and the mother says to her, "Would you like to see some of his pictures that he's working on?" And the babysitter, wanting to make a good impression, she says, "Of course, let's see his artwork." And so at that point, the text that is on the left of the page stops, and you're sort of invited to see these pictures along with Mallory. And there's not too much commentary on what she's seeing. I'm just sort of letting you see the images and reach your own conclusions. So if you were reading the book and you got to, this is like page 18, at this point, you would just start flipping through the illustrations yourself. And you would see there's a little boy on a tree and birds. And if you turn the page again, you'd see two more. And if you turn the page again, you'd see this one. And then you would just launch right back into the narrative. And so that's a sort of device that appears over and over in the book. If you've ever had a 5-year-old or a little kid who likes to draw, you know that the drawings tend to proliferate. They tend to start appearing all over your house. And every time Mallory finds one, or every time Teddy gives her one, you see it along with her. They start to turn sinister. They start to turn, like, you know, curiously violent. And as the book progresses, it's not really giving away too much. I think this happens by page 70. Something even stranger happens. They start getting better. She starts finding illustrations that no 5-year-old should be able to draw. And she's sort of baffled by where they're coming from. And even more intriguingly, she starts to suspect that maybe these pictures are telling a story. Maybe there are like clues in them. And she's going to play sleuth and try to figure it out. So there's a mystery at the center of it all. But it's also like suspense with a little supernatural element too. And I will stop my share. It's back on screen.
So I gotta ask, man, did you sell this on spec, like with just a proposal, or did you sell the completed manuscript?
No, well, so here's the thing. I was really worried about this because when you try to describe an illustration to someone, 1,000 people will have 1,000 different interpretations you're talking about. And I knew that and because the pictures are like clues, they're like pieces of this puzzle, the only way to sell this is to give the publishers everything and let them experience what the readers are going to experience. So then that began the tricky part of, you know, approaching the two illustrators, Will and Doogie, and saying, look, I don't have a contract. I don't even have a manuscript, but I'm going to do this. I want you guys to draw the pictures. Please go on this journey with me. And they were great. They're like, absolutely, let's do it. We'll figure out the money later.
So wait, did they come up with the complete sequences of like a drawing sequence, like the one we just saw at the beginning, before you even had the manuscript? You just told them what the sequence was?
Well, I would know like the scene was happening. I knew there was a scene where the babysitter got interviewed and she was first introduced to Teddy's drawings. And so for that sequence, I just gave them some pretty general direction. I was like, I just need pictures that a kid would draw, but the last one has to be a little boy next to a kind of like wraith or ghoul. Like there was one very specific request. And then the other ones, I always tried to give them as much free reign as possible because, I mean, I know you know these guys a little bit. They're just so creative. I knew that they would come up with any idea they had was going to be better than what I had. So,
which isn't always the case with artists, but those guys are exceptions. They're amazing.
Yeah, and that was fun too because there were also it took a long time to get to that style for Teddy, like the 5-year-old style. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of outtakes that were just too sophisticated, like the characters. They had elbows and knees, and you know, and but I think we ended up with a style that it's still better than like a real 5-year-old would draw, like, to be honest, but they're sort of aesthetically pleasing and they feel like convincingly fake.
But they sell the image and they feel 5-year-old enough, you know? So the last thing I want to ask about sales, just because we haven't talked, is was this a tough sell, or were people did people get it, or did you find that some editors were just like, I don't know what's going on here?
I tell this story. the only person who balked at it, there was one editor, and when he found out it was 3 guys, he said, well, can one of them be a woman? And I was like, no,
We'll get on that.
like we just illustrated everything. Like I can't do that. But no one balked at the concept. People seemed okay with it.
Well, it's funny. And the reason I asked that is because I've found in publishing that finding someone who has a really good visual sense as well as sort of editorial sense is rarer than I thought it would be. Because I started out working with you, and just to be flattering, you can, plug your ears, but you really spoiled me in terms of you had an idea what the cover was going to be. You had an idea of what the market was looking for, and you were really, really good, both at concept, also the text editing part of it, but also just the visuals and pulling it together. And I've got editors who are, or have worked with editors or know editors who are terrific editors. But when it comes to the covers, they're just sort of like, I don't know, that one's fine. And I'm like,
I know. I appreciate everything you said, but I mean, to give you, here's one more great example of what you're talking about. There's an Amazon page for my book, and obviously you should buy the copies from Poison Pen because they're signed and stamped by yours truly. But on the Amazon page, it does not mention that the book is illustrated.
Right.
It makes no mention of the illustrations. And I said to the publisher, I don't know, do you think you might want to mention that? And they're like, no. I'm like, they just don't seem to find it as interesting as I do. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, it's also interesting because I feel like, I don't know. So my quick anecdote is, because I've always felt like that visuals and books or text had like a moat full of scorpions between them in publishing. Like my wife is a chef who has a restaurant called Dirt Candy. And so we had this idea to do this graphic novel cookbook. Like no one had done a graphic novel cookbook. So we sold it. People were excited. We went with the person who paid the most money because they just kept going up. And we're like, they really want this. We had our first editorial meeting and the editor said, so this graphic novel cookbook, how about if it's not a graphic novel? And we're like, wait, this is the whole point. This is the reason we're doing this. And so like you're saying about the Amazon page, I feel like there's just this disconnect. Like, I don't know. I grew up in it. I mean, you and I are roughly the same age. So growing up in the 70s and 80s. And I feel like that was before. I feel like a lot of like illustrated books now are graphic novels. And I feel like we grew up kind of when text was getting introduced, text and illustrations work together in weird ways. I don't know if you want to talk about the background stuff, but I know you've got, but like the big thing for me growing up was, I don't know if people remember this book, but Cathedral, which is these gorgeous sort of mechanical drawings. And I mean, it's a picture book to some extent, but there's schematics, there's plans, there's blueprints. And it was just, that was sort of the big style at the time, is for visuals to get more and more interesting and lavish. And it was largely done in kids' books because that was where you could go outside the boundaries. But I don't know if you had, I mean, was that your experience too?
I brought, I don't know if people remember this one at all. I'm dating myself. I think this was 1980. This is a book called Masquerade. This was a book, it was a pretty big bestseller. This artist had created this 18-karat gold sculpture of a rabbit that was reportedly worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he buried it. And if you read Masquerade, there's sort of a story, and there are these pictures, and within the book was clues that led you to where this treasure was buried, and you could go dig it up and then you would be rich. And when I heard that when I was 9 years old, I got this book and I got obsessed with it, and I studied. It's only 32 pages, full color. I remember seeing it in a Kmart, like on an aisle end cap, when I was like 8 or 9 years old. So it must have been like a pretty popular book.
Yeah, it was huge. Yeah.
And I just,
Gentlemen, let me intervene here because I have a different perspective. I'm a child of the 1940s. And
Okay.
I will tell you that my uncle, a child of the 1930s, had a collection of what was called Little Big Books, Flash Gordon,
sure.
and the whole bit. And a huge part of that, and one of the reasons I loved them when I was a child, was the illustrations. They were a sort of graphic novel. So there was Flash Gordon and the Emperor Ming,
Yeah.
And now let's go all the way back to Sherlock Holmes. The huge success of Sherlock Holmes was, in fact, the pageant illustrations in the Strand magazine. And then I'm trying to remember the name of the guy, but there was a whole series of classic novels, Robin Hood and Ivanhoe and all this. And the illustrator, whose name is temporarily escaping me, but Patrick will use the chat function to remind me. And that was an integral part. And those were books that, that we read as youngsters, even maybe as teenagers. Even Bullfinch's Mythology was full of, wonderful graphic illustrations. So publishing goes in cycles. It really does. And,
it cycles, and it's also a really fascinating evolution, because the books you're talking about were illustrated, right? They take scenes from the book and illustrate them.
Exactly.
And then when Jason and I were growing up, it was like, they were trying to go beyond that. We're going to do a mystery picture where you have to find clues in it. We're going to give you blueprints and schematics and architectural drawings. And then it's sort of that slowly morphed into graphic novels where it's all working together. So it's been this interesting evolution, And I remember there were experiments in the 60s with abstract visual books, which was very short-lived. I don't think they were popular. So you see it move from the literal to the more sort of abstract. But the Masquerade book, Jason, is amazing because there were also a bunch of imitators of that. And in fact, Byron Price did one in 80s, 82, 83 called The Secret. And he buried like 12 treasure boxes around, and he died and only 3 of them were found. And no one knows where the other 9 are. And of course, by now, whatever landmarks were referred to are gone. Like they've probably been built on. But like, I love this idea that these are just buried out there.
Well, I have one other one that I brought. I have a very vivid memory. This is one of the earliest memories I have. In 1st grade, I went to my school library, and I guess I didn't know who Alfred Hitchcock was, but there were these anthologies for young readers. This was Haunted Houseful. I also have Ghostly Gallery, and I have a bunch of these. Daring Detectives. They were all on the shelf. I can picture it plain as day. And I remember at 6 years old, I took them down. I walked up to the librarian, and she said, "You're too young to read these. You can't borrow these until you're in 3rd grade. You have to come back." And I probably was too young to read them, but like I would have just looked at the pictures, because there were like these beautiful illustrations in them, and I knew there were ghosts in this book and pictures of ghosts, and that was enough.
Yeah. 100%.
But I waited 2 years to look at them, and now I own them. So
Patrick has popped up to tell us that Arthur Rackham was the name of the illustrator that I couldn't remember.
Yes. Yes.
They were amazing. And what was the other one? Oh, Rockwell Kent. But what I think is so fascinating about this book is that your illustrations give a voice to a character in the story that otherwise would be missing. And, that's a little different than Arthur Rackham painting, the Lady of Shalott or something of the sort, which is gorgeous, but really didn't advance the narrative. And that's what I think is so remarkable about Hidden Pictures.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that was like the big goal of mine, was to not just make them decorative like, a 19th century novel would be, but to make them sort of integral and organic and have them advance the story. And so I spent a lot of time I spent a couple months just trying to figure out how, like, where could these pictures be coming from? I didn't know there was a 5-year-old boy drawing them, but I knew that I wanted them to keep appearing and advancing the story. And so my daughter, who's now 15, we have a vast archive of her illustrations from when she was young, like hundreds of them, because my wife won't throw them away. And so I was like, oh yeah, that's it. That's what we'll do. It'll be a kid.
Once you got illustrating with Will and Doogie, did it change a whole lot, or by then you were pretty locked in terms of how you were using the pictures?
It didn't change that much, but I mean, often they would give me something and they would contribute ideas to the picture, and I was like, oh, right, of course, that's so much better. And then I'd go back and rewrite what I did. And then the last illustration, and if you get this book, I would encourage you to not look at the end of the book, because there are spoilers in the pictures. But I knew the book should end with a picture. I didn't know what it was going to be. But then I saw one of the early pictures, and I thought, oh, it would be cool if there was a symmetry to the book. If the first and last pictures were like the same but different. It's hard to explain without spoiling big parts of the story. But that's an example of something where, like, until I started seeing pictures, I didn't know what I was going to do, you know, and then I
Yeah. And was your editor weighing in on the pictures or just the text?
no input on the art whatsoever. They
Yeah.
loved it. They loved it all, which was great. You know?
Yeah.
But I was surprised because we were all nervous, you know, like
Yeah.
the artists were like, oh boy, I hope there's not going to be a lot of comments. And I'm like, well, me too. But if there are, you're going to have to listen, even if you disagree, and no changes to the art.
Well, so one of the things I thought was really interesting. So one of the reasons I like this book or really fell in love with this book is there's a great gag early on that I don't want to spoil, but I think talking about sort of visual literacy and how to make this stuff work is fascinating to people because no one thinks about how this stuff works unless you're having to make it work, and that's rare. So I don't know, can you talk a little about, like, because I think page turns are huge. You know, it's something you learn when you do something you learn when you do comics is that bottom right hand panel has to make people turn the page, and there has to be some delivery. You know, some people say it's got to be the upper left hand panel, but other people say it's the other right hand page. But there's got to be that turn and that payoff, that surprise. But page turns are huge. I don't know if you want to talk about using those and how you sort of figured them out.
I mean, there's actually, I'll just go back to that thing I just showed you. There's an example of it right there. Here, wait, sorry. In this sequence that I showed you where he was, where the flipping through the pictures, I definitely wanted the picture on the left to be on the left so that when you're flipping through them and you turn the page, there is like the surprise and like it's not quite as dramatic as like a jump scare in a horror movie, but I was like thinking like,
close.
You want to hide that image, and so the reader sees it as soon as they turn the page. And there actually was like an originally there was an extra image in that sequence, and I cut it so that that image would shift to the left side, if that makes any sense. And you're right, that's a total comic book. That's a comic book trick. You know, the image on the bottom right should always make you turn the page, and then you put your surprises on the top left.
Right. Oh, and there's also the timing factor because you don't want the pictures that come before it to be so complicated people spend much time on them. You sort of want boom, dot, 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 boom. You know, getting that rhythm down is, you know, hard.
Yeah, but it's super fun.
Yeah. So also, like, did you figure out any other layout tricks when you were doing this in terms of bringing the image in with the text?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the layout was pretty simple. Like once I decided, okay, every image gets its own full page, then there really wasn't that much to do.
Right. Well, I guess there's facing pages and single pages, right?
Oh yeah, well, that's true.
I mean, that's a page turn thing, but.
Right.
And then progressing from one artist to the other, was that particularly like something you really had to strain to figure out, or you knew exactly where that was going to happen?
I wouldn't say it was difficult to figure out, but it was fun because there's actually a sequence. It's hard to describe without spoilers, but there is one sequence in the book that the two illustrators worked on together because it's sort of a transition from the childish drawings to a more perhaps supernaturally fueled adult style. And so they both worked. There's like 8 or 9 pictures there that get progressively better and better and better, and they were able to work on those together.
Yes. And then the weirdest thing to me about this book, that just because, and this is because I've worked with you as an editor, I've worked with you on covers, but the most important visual part of this book, the cover, was just a cover process. You know, like they were like, you weren't like having, like, you did not say, I want this cover. They were doing a traditional cover process where they present you with a lot of choices and you talk with it with your editor, right?
Yeah, I can show some of those. I brought some.
Oh yeah. I love early.
I was fortunate in that one of my illustrators, Will Staley, is a book jacket designer, and he's pretty like well regarded in the book jacket design community. So when I said, well, it'd be really nice if Will could do it, they didn't bat an eye. They're like, absolutely, if he wants to do it, he can. So I'll show some concepts that were rejected, and I'll tell you a quick funny story. I think initially they thought it would be really fun to have a hidden picture on the cover. So, you know, here you've got like the faces and the flowers and the vase. This was not, nobody really liked it though. I like it, but I like this one.
Yeah.
This is a really
like
strong
that.
cover, I think. And they had all different variations of this with different fonts, but the idea is that the paper, if you look at it, you see a skull in it. And I
Yeah.
would have been really happy with this cover if they ended up with it. I think it's pretty interesting and unique. And it
Yeah,
gets,
I actually like that a lot.
yeah, I
Me
do
too, and
too.
it actually looks more like the book. I mean, it fits
Yeah.
the inside of the book awfully well.
Yeah, I understand. I agree. Like there's it's sort of like on point thematically and to the story. And but it's a, well,
It's a group
it's not
process.
democracy, but it's definitely a group process. Um, this one I don't think was good, but it's kind of cool. The idea is that the center of that flower is kind of ripped paper and there's a skull underneath it.
Were they actually going to do a die cut for that, or that's
I
just?
don't think so. I don't think so. I
Okay.
think it's just a faux rip. This one came really close to being the cover, and I know you like this one, Grady. I did
Yeah.
not see the skull in this cover for probably 6 or 7 minutes. I didn't understand why they were sending it to me. Do you see it, Barbara? Like, did you see it
I
immediately?
do, but until you said that, I'm not sure that I focused on it. But yeah, the top of the skull is your name. Then we have the eyes, and the fence is the teeth, and the nose is the little house there.
So they actually printed up galleys with this cover, and they were all set to make it the cover. And I was torn because, like, on one hand, I thought, wow, this is really unique and different. But I was also really worried that someone just casually, browsing Poison Pen, walking by the book, might not see what they're supposed to see.
Yeah. Well, now, can I ask a question? What was the rationale for them being hot on this cover, but cooler on the other skull cover?
Thank you.
Which I thought the skull was much more distinctive.
I agree. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I prefer this one.
Yeah, me too.
It's a fabulous cover.
They really
is.
like this one.
But as you both know, it's ultimately the sales department that decides
Yeah.
on the cover. So, artistic merit has very little to do with final cover decisions. And they apparently didn't think the red one would sell as well as this more traditional one. Great. If I'd only known, we would have printed up the other cover, wrapped your book up in it. It would really be a fabulous thing to do. Maybe it's not too late.
Special edition, limited to the
Yeah,
Poison
no,
Pen.
I mean, really seriously, there was a great, years and years ago, there was a very funny author who wrote a book called Who in Hell is Wanda Fuka? Obviously set in Seattle. And the Seattle Mystery Bookstore, which was still in business then, just wrapped it in brown paper. They made a limited edition by, creating their own cover. And I've often thought that would be a really good thing to do. But this is go back to the red one, if you will, because I think that's just an amazing cover.
Yeah, I agree. I liked it. Ironically, I'll tell you the funny story. This cover, the design, when Will did it, the art director said, I'm not even going to show them this one because this one is too commercial and they'll pick it. And I said, well, what does that mean, too commercial? He's like, it's like the kind of book that like a lot of stores would take,
Yeah.
I was like, well, you're saying that like that's a bad thing, like and so ultimately it came down to this one or this one. And I came down on the side of the one that's on screen right now, just because to me, it just seemed like a safer choice.
Yeah.
Well, you'd be happy to know that you did succeed commercially because your book has not only been reprinted, but may have gone back for a third already.
Oh, gosh. Well, that's news to me. I didn't even know that.
Now, see, booksellers, we're the ones that have the secret information, but, it's good news for you that it's reprinted because that means that it's done well.
Well, so yeah, and I think it's funny because the designers are like, well, this is not going to win any design awards, but sometimes the most interesting covers, the covers that do win design awards, maybe aren't necessarily going to.
Well, here's the thought: if it's a flaming success, maybe the paperback can have the red cover.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. I do think it's really cool.
So can we talk about addiction for a moment? Why is it that you decided to make Mallory? You almost set her up to be a kind of unreliable narrator, or certainly an unreliable companion to this child. Why did you decide to do that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I got to a certain point in the story where, again, I was thinking about the turn of the screw and the idea that this governess slash babysitter should be unreliable, because the characters in these stories, they're always unreliable. They're the only ones who can see the supernatural element and no one believes them. And I was trying to make it feel super contemporary. I wanted these characters to be like, you know, shopping at Starbucks and eating at Cheesecake Factory and stuff like that. And I had just become aware of OxyContin. My sister-in-law, going back 10 years ago, she's a pathologist, but she got a job in a lab working with people. Everyone in the lab was in recovery. So she was the one who first introduced and started telling me about like OxyContin and telling me these stories before anybody was talking about like the Sackler family. She was like, "There's a real problem," and so then I was, you know, as I learned more about that from her, I was like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to be my very contemporary problem that I'm going to give to my character. And then, you know, of course, I had to read the book, and you know, I said, you got to make sure I'm like not screwing this up. And so that's how I arrived at all that.
And I didn't even think about the turn of the screw thing, but you've even got a pool in there, like turn of the screw. I didn't even make that connection.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't because of turn of the screw. I just wanted the pool, but you know.
Yeah, you're working on levels. So just while we're talking about covers for a second too, like just because we never talk about this stuff, but for you, like what's frustrating about coming up with a cover, and how do you know when you've got one? Because you always had a really good gut for covers when we worked together, and a lot of covers you came up with. So, and I know sales has a big part of it, but Quirk was a smaller publisher, and I feel like, you know, sales didn't run the ship the way it would in a much larger publishing house. And so you always had a good gut, man. So what was it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what it was is we had a really small list, and we had the luxury of obsessing over covers because we were only doing 25 books a year. And I think you and I have talked about this a little bit. At these larger houses where they're doing more books, I feel like the goal is to get to a consensus quickly.
Right.
And maybe not necessarily get to a dynamite cover 500 times a year, you know, because it's hard to do that when you have these massive lists. You just want to get to a cover that is good enough. But at Quirk, we only had 25 titles, and we also really didn't have like marketing budgets. So like the book was the marketing. Like you had to,
right.
The idea was you would see the book in the store and you had to pick it up because the cover was going to be so compelling, and the title and all of it, like it was the marketing, the book. And and we could tell if when the cover went on the table, you could just sense this palpable reaction in the room. If it was the right cover, you could feel it. And it took a while to like recognize it, but then it was like, they were like, okay, no one's feeling this. Like you can just tell. And it's very hard to say with a designer, these are all good, but they're just not good enough. But our designers eventually got to the point where like, we know what you mean. I'll do more, you know, I'll keep trying, you know, and sometimes you had they would do like 50 covers, but oh my gosh, this is like an infamous one. And this was probably the most successful book I worked on there, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. This came after like 50 covers, and there are elements from like 10 killed covers on this cover. Like this scrawly type at the bottom was something they tried on one of the failed attempts. This floating girl was something they tried on one of the failed attempts. These little ornate little things. And so I think by doing 30 covers, they arrived at this cover. Which also infamously, Barbara, you might appreciate this story. When we presented this book to Barnes & Noble, their order was 0. They took no books because it was a young adult novel, and they said, kids don't like black and white covers, and you guys screwed it up. And I was like, well, I don't know, I kind of like it. And indie booksellers love that cover. And so they made it work. And then eventually Barnes & Noble was like, all right, we should carry it too.
Which I think is amazing to, you know, not to be able to go out there and fly in the face of a Barnes and Noble saying, we're just not going to order any, because you guys just really believed that was the right cover. And I was actually just talking to someone who worked for y'all for a little while, back in the day. And she said the reason she wound up working for Quirk is she saw that cover and was like, whoever's putting something like this out there, like, I want to work for them.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah,
I mean, it was also easy to say no to Barnes & Noble because like everything was so low budget. It's not like we had a lot of money invested in it. Everything we did was cheap.
Right, right.
So it was like
the Roger
That's an
Corman
honest
model.
admission. Good for
well,
you.
it's true. It's true. I mean,
So
everything,
I will say, Grady, that the one publishing operation of any size that I've been involved in, their system, which I absolutely hated, but they're really into commercial fiction, is that they looked for comp covers. And all they wanted to do was because, you know, there's a whole trend. I mean, right now, the World War II women's story is just, you know, an enormous trend. And the covers are almost identical. If you look at them, you line up the whole group, you know, I mean, you
Are
can
those the
just
ones where
tell.
it's like kind of a scenic thing over water or something? And there's kind of half of a face sort of floating up at the top?
Well, do you remember when, I'm trying to remember what the genre was, but basically the cover was a woman's derriere and her stocking legs, usually with seams, and then fuck me shoes. I mean, and that was on cover after cover after cover. And, you know, I think what it is they figured that if one book is successful with this cover, if you're really being commercial, then you can make your book successful if it has a similar look, which is entirely the opposite of what Jason was doing at Quirk Books.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
and it's interesting because I don't know, we lived through, Jason, the boom when every cover was a woman walking away from the reader with her back to the reader.
I think when this was in YA, Twilight was the big thing. So I think they were expecting like a purple cover with like a moon and also a woman's face in silhouette or something like that.
She lived here. We did a Twilight event when the book first came out, and you would never have guessed what was going to happen. It's so interesting, you know, when, I mean, sometimes you can tell from all the buzz and whatever, but sometimes you get a book and you think, really? And then it turns around. I mean, I had to actually argue with Putnam to get Delia Owen to come to the store to sign copies of her book. I mean, you know, crawdads. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I liked it. I wanted her to sign 100 copies for our first mystery club. I didn't want to bother her with books on her doorstep, you know, so eventually they agreed. I think 3 people came. And, you know, it was me and 3 people and Delia and, you know, like 100 books or whatever it is. If I'd known, I'd have bought 1,000, right? Or possibly 10,000.
Right.
How can you tell? And I'm always so moved by that, you know, when the unexpected, I mean, you could tell when publishers are throwing zillions at a book that it may do well just because of the publicity and the marketing. But I love it when you get a book like Crawdads or, you know, and you don't expect it to blossom up the way that it has. And it's so much fun to see that happen.
Yeah.
Well, actually, Barbara, something, go ahead, Jason.
No, those are my favorite publishing stories. You know, the ones that.
Well, I was going to say, Barbara, something you were just saying about comp copies or comps for covers. I interviewed a ton of cover illustrators who were all working in the 90s for a project, and they said the death of covers was Photoshop, but not because of the artists. They were like, we were great with Photoshop. We loved it. The problem was sales and marketing would start roughing up what they wanted, cobbled together from other covers already out there in Photoshop. And before that, they could just say it and you could ignore them. But now they sort of had the power to make rough covers and then just say, do this. Jason, I don't know if you want to talk about the Best Friends Exorcism cover with the women walking away, because that was one that we worked on together.
Yeah, you probably remember it a little better than I do. Do you have? A share?
Oh yeah, hold on. Let's see, which one is it?
We did struggle it. I remember a really weird photo shoot for this book.
Oh, it's not letting me. That's okay. My computer's having an issue. It just downloaded because I had all the rough covers we had where they were all women walking away from the reader, and then there's one that isn't, and we were like, let's go in that direction.
Yeah.
I can also remember that there was a time when publishers, maybe they still do occasionally, actually commissioned artists to paint. Let's take Tony Hillerman, for example, because Tony Hillerman, you won't be surprised to know, was huge for the Poison Pen in his day. And so they had a guy that painted his covers. But what happens is they licensed the painting, and then the artist turned around and asked us if we would sell prints of his artwork, which we did for years for the Tony Hillerman books. So people would be kind of weirded out. They come into the store and here would be, you know, this huge print hanging from the ceiling and all. They'd go, wait, you know, it's the Blessing Way. And I say, yes, you know, but the artist actually owns the work and the publisher licensed it from him. But I'm not seeing today a lot of that. Do you, either one of you, have any familiarity with that?
Hardcase Prime still does that, right? I think the Hardcase
fully painted, yeah.
They still have paintings, but
yeah, and actually one of the reasons that changed is so the publishers used to buy the paintings from the artist outright, and they started filling up their offices with paintings, and they didn't know what to do with them, and they were throwing them out, and they felt bad about. But like someone was telling me at the oh gosh, it wasn't Berkeley. It might have been Berkeley, but the Berkeley office, they were like everywhere you went. You went in the bathroom, there were cover paintings, like leaning up against the wall. You went in the storage, you couldn't get anything. So finally they said to artists, we'll pay you less money to license it and you keep it and do whatever you want.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I like that. I remember for an author, you wouldn't know her, but for her, I'm trying to remember, anyway, some landmark book, I actually bought the artwork and gave it to her as a present. And I was really excited that I was able to buy her the original painting, you know, and give it to her.
Well, I will always kick myself. This was the first book Jason and I did together at Horror Store. And it's designed to look like an IKEA catalog, but this furniture layout you're seeing here, and then the one on the back cover, Andy commissioned an artist. Andy Reid, who is the art director at Quirk, commissioned an artist who was making these tiny dioramas. And this is about what, Jason, like 11 or 12 inches wide in real life?
Yeah, we were gonna buy IKEA furniture and do a photo shoot, and it was gonna cost about $3,000 to get all the furniture we wanted. And then we realized, Andy realized, she said, you know, I could hire a miniature artist to make the furniture, and it's probably gonna cost about $150 because everything's so tiny, the materials are so cheap. And we're like, let's do that. That was her second book that she ever designed.
It's so great. And I will kill myself, just when you were saying, Barbara, about buying the art, I will kick myself that I didn't buy this tiny diorama of Horror Store at the time. Because I think it was like, I saw a picture, it was like this big, it was teeny.
It's pretty nice to have in your office.
I know, right? But I was also gonna say, you know, it's funny, I mean, we're talking about covers, talking about interiors, but you're saying that this book, Barbara, I think is already possibly going into third printing. People really love this stuff, and you wonder why there's not more of it. Like, is it just that there's not enough authors who have these ideas for how to combine words and pictures? Or, I mean, Jason, you've seen submissions out there, like when you were an editor, like, are there not many of these projects around, or are there a ton of them and they just aren't getting to market? Like, why aren't there more?
I never got any. I wish there were more. Because if you think about how we're reading on screens right now, you know, all the eye candy online, people are looking at their phones, you know, all the time. And and you know, I wish
guys, it takes a pivotal book to start a trend. I mean, it really does. Look at Twilight, for example. We already talked about that. Who knew, you know, that that whole genre was going to become a thing, but it took Twilight too. Who knew that Crawdads was going to create a whole subgenre, you know, which it has certainly done. And so let's hope that Jason, in fact, has done the same thing with Hidden Pictures. It's perfectly possible.
Knock on wood.
I hope so. Well, and also, you know, visuals are hard. You know, like you said, you had to go out and get these two artists to basically take a huge chance with you. And if they didn't know you and hadn't worked with you, they probably wouldn't have been likely to do that.
Right. No, that's true. Yeah. And it would have just been, then I would be paying them out of pocket.
Yeah.
And, which would be, you know, get really complicated and expensive. And that's probably
everyone would get a slice of failure pie, which is the worst pie.
So just to go back to the book, sorry, I'm more text than I am pictures here at the moment. I know it's tiresome of me. Did you see the direction this story was going to take from the beginning, and the pictures develop that, or did your final way the story unfolds was a result of the art? Which way did it go?
I think it started with, you know, the story came to me pretty quickly. Like, it came to me like in like 24 or 48 hours. And I knew there were going to be a couple things that happened. I always knew the art was going to get better as the story advanced. I knew I mean, like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of weird. I spent 3 months walking around thinking about it and not writing anything, but just, you know, it was driving me crazy because I was like, I cannot figure this out. And then one day it magically appeared to me. And I know it didn't magically appear to me. I think like what happened was like, if you know, they say like your brain like works on things when you're not thinking and like it's doing the work for you, like while you're sleeping or whatever. I think that's what happened. I wish I could make it happen again.
Well, it is funny. I mean, this horrible little office I'm in is 3 blocks from my house, and this is where I write. And when I go home for lunch, that's always that 3-block walk from home, from work to home, is when I'm like, oh, that's how I solved that problem I've been banging my head against.
No, it's crazy. It doesn't feel like work. When you leave your desk and walk around, you feel like, well, I'm not working because I'm not on my computer, but that is so often exactly what you need to be doing. You need to go take a walk, you know? But I have to tell myself that's still all the time, you know?
Yeah.
I wish we could actually talk about how the story unfolds, which is a no-no when we're talking about a book that has just come out. I often wish that what we could, and we have done this several times, what I really like to do is have like a book club meeting, you know, 6 months from now, when it's mandatory that you've read the book, and then we can talk about, you know, really interesting stuff. I've done that with several authors, and it's been hugely popular. We did one with Brad Thorne. We had people in New Zealand who stayed up, you know, till some weird hour in order to join into it. So it's an interesting thing to think about. But one of the questions we most often get when we do these conversations is about your process. So that's why I was kind of going that way. You know, there's always a question about, you know, did you plot it out, or are you a pantser? You know, how did it happen? So you're saying that basically this is a story that kind of came to you early, and then you fleshed it out for several months while your brain was turning away?
Yeah, I did not. Well, I mean, it was such a weird thing because I knew I wanted to work with these 2 illustrators. I knew the illustrations were going to be clues. I sort of like laid a lot of groundwork that had nothing to do with the actual story. And then the story just sort of presented itself to me one day, almost magically. And I knew like there's a big surprise at the end of the book, and I knew what that surprise was.
Well, that was actually my question. Were you always writing towards that?
Yeah, I was always writing toward that. Like that
Okay.
didn't surprise me. I always knew that was what it was going to be. And so it was actually, once I had that moment of revelation, then writing the book was actually a pretty quick thing to do. It took me about 9 months because there was no discovery involved. I was just, I had a really good sense of everything that was happening. I hope one day something like that happens to me again because it felt like divine intervention.
So Grady, you up there gnashing your teeth and hoping the same thing will go on for you?
Grady's on deadline. He has a When's your book due? I know you're taking time away from your deadline.
Tuesday.
Oh, so you got
Well, you know, I've got the problem where someone calls it you think with your fingers. So you've been through this with me, man. After you, my editors have had real whiplash and wait, I got to read another manuscript and like pay attention because I generate a ton of drafts. The book I'm doing now, it was 4 completely different versions of this book before, 3 completely different versions before we got to the 4th one. That's the one working, and they're all like 150,000 words, 160,000 words, which is too long. And so now we've got the one, and we've gone through. This is the 2nd round of revisions on it, and then we'll do one more and then copy edits. But it's due on Tuesday, so I like to do it the hard way. Huh?
How many words is it?
I've got it at, I keep it right here. Right now it is at 123,062. And I've got it on these revisions down to 121, and I want to get it down to like 119. I just want to keep cutting whatever fat there is. You know me, I get really married to these like, it's a paragraph that I love. Oh my God, it's so good. And you'll take it out and I won't even notice it's
If
gone.
we were still working together, I would say I could cut some words out of it. I remember doing it.
Oh yeah. No, you were beautiful. You would get in there with them and you'd just be like, let me do this. And like, I'd be like, yeah, it's much better this way.
So
That's the old Elmore Leonard line. I think it's Elmore Leonard. I leave out the words that readers skip.
yes.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting, isn't it, that revision most of the time is cutting, is rarely adding. Although I have to say, and you know, when in the many, because I probably edited 800 or 900 books for Poison Pen Press, sometimes the conversation would be, "What's this?" And the author would say, you know, blah 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 blah, and then I'd say, "Wonderful," I say, but if that's in your head and not on the page, it's not going to help.
Oh, yeah.
So occasionally it was the opposite, where you had to flesh something out. But most of the time, it really is about, you know, cutting back.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if this happened for you, Jason, or with you, Barbara, when you're editing, but I've also found that there's sometimes just a sentence missing or a phrase, and suddenly the whole paragraph reads differently, which runs into I mean, there would be that one sentence, and it's not even a genius sentence. Oftentimes, it's what I like to think of as a laugh track sentence, which is something that indicates to the reader, like, what's going through their heads. You know, it's like an adjective or just something to give a little like emotional color to it. Yeah, that's what I've been doing a lot on this one, because like you said, there's a lot in your head and you're like, I need to put that on the page, but it seems so crude.
That even comes into play in book selling. I spend a lot of time trying to think up, you know, because there's a limited amount of space I can, without exhausting the reader. Well, you saw my newsletter today, so you can see how, you know, hard you have to work at that. Trying to find that one thing that will really convey the joy of this book, you know, is hard work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, Patrick, why don't you come and join us? I'm sure you have questions or comments of your own. And thank you for reminding me the names of the illustrators. Isn't this great? This is a Shakespeare moment when he comes up. Like, I tell him, you know, I never can decide if he's really Caliban or Ariel.
Yeah, I was going to say the ghost of Hamlet's father.
Well, actually,
Oh,
There you go.
Perfect.
Right, Patrick, do you have a copy of the book that shows the stamps that Jason did, because they're so neat?
Sure. Yeah, here we go.
On the inside.
Yeah, of course. Very
No, I mean right on the title page where he put the stamps.
Oh, excuse me, of
I can
course.
show it on mine. I have it.
Yeah, here we go.
There they are. Right,
Oh,
so
nice.
our copies come with these two wonderful stamps that Jason was kindly enough to add to his signature. I really love those.
Yeah, I use them on everything now. Now that I have the, they're like self-inking stamps. So all my utility bills, all of anything around the house, I'm like,
Con Ed probably wonders what in the world you're up to.
right,
Love it.
exactly. Verizon is like, okay.
So Patrick, do we have
Yeah,
any questions
do.
or comments?
Yes, let's see here. A lot of people tuning in on YouTube tonight
Oh, good.
and Facebook, but let's see here. Lynn would like to know, Jason, with the illustrations playing such a big role in your book, how do you feel about the way they were translated for the ebook edition?
Oh,
That's a good question. I have not looked at the ebook edition because, you know, I think they're probably going to look fine depending on like what kind of device you have. Like, I think nothing is going to look as sharp as the print edition. And I guess I haven't seen any sales numbers yet, but I'm going to guess that this book is probably going to have like a disproportionate number of sales in print versus ebook. Like, I think if you heard about this book, you would probably want to seek out the print edition. One interesting challenge I had, though, a little related to the question, is when it came time to do the audiobook, because audio is such an increasingly popular sales channel for publishers, we realized we had kind of a sticky problem because you can't see all the pictures in the audiobook. So I actually had to go in and write about an extra 1,500 words where Mallory would describe not all the pictures, but certain pictures that were just absolutely essential to understanding the story. Because characters would start talking about the pictures, you know, so I had to add a little bit of new text for the audiobook.
I was going to ask how you did that. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I remember I used to volunteer to read for the blind and dyslexic at one of the studios. And sometimes we would come up with that challenge, you know, where you're trying to describe a illustration. Let's see. Laura says, good covers and good titles are like the twins from The Shining. They say, come and play with us. I don't know about Laura. Let's see here. What else do we have? Oh, were there any outtakes as far as the illustrations? Any that didn't quite make the finished book?
Lots. I mean, probably well over like 100 outtakes. You know, I would say to Doogie, I would say, look, I need a drawing of a man burying a body in a hole. And it looks like a 5-year-old did it. And the drawings actually didn't take him that long to do because, you know, they are just like scribbles. So he could, it's not like he was spending hours on each picture. He would sort of draw them in about 5 minutes, 7 minutes. So he would usually come to me with like 10 versions and say, which one do you like the best? And they were all slightly different. I wish I had some to share. The other interesting thing I remember that he told me is the illustrator is right-handed, but he drew with his left hand to sort of make everything look more unskilled and primitive, which I thought was a really smart thing to do.
Let's see. This is a great handle on YouTube. Creepy Kitty Creations would like to know, do you have any tips on coming up with a good cover design? I personally struggle with typography.
No, I don't. I'm not a cover designer. I mean, I love working with cover designers, but I don't know that I would be. I don't know that I have any advice to cover designers. Do you have any advice, Grady? Do you?
The only thing I would say is typography is really, really important. I did a book, Final Girl Support Group, and I'm such a pro. I have a copy. I don't have a copy here, but it's a chair sort of at a 3/4 angle, like dripping blood, floating in midair, and then the title, Final Girl Support Group, and it wasn't clicking. We were going over this thing and over this thing and over this thing. We were looking at all these different verbs, chair higher, chair lower, more blood, less blood, all this stuff. It was such, like, no one could figure it out. And finally someone said, wait, the chair is at a 3/4 angle and the type is dead on. And if we just drop the type a little and make it interact with the chair slightly, so instead of being on 2 different planes, that they were both on the same plane, that might work. And do a little drop shadow on the letters so it looks like the chair is sort of over them in some cases. And we did, it was the most minor visual adjustment I've ever seen, and the whole thing snapped together. And so having your typography interact with your text, or sorry, with your image, is so important, because otherwise it just looks like they're sitting on top of each other, or they're just 2 separate elements. Everything has to be pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
That is really brilliant. Could I recommend a book that is absolutely fabulous by British journalist Simon Garfield? It's called Just My Type, a book about fonts.
Right,
and he goes through, but what's wonderful is that he does talk about the emotional impact. And one of his great things was the type that they decided upon for the British tube system, and why it is they chose the particular font and so forth, you know, for all the tube signs. And if you're at all interested in typography or struggling with it or whatever, this book is absolutely fabulous. I truly recommend it. Garfield, Simon Garfield.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about that book. I've had it on my list for a long time.
I love it. I've read it cover to cover, and we've carried it in the store. But you know, I mean, first, I've been to the Gutenberg Museum more than once, and not in Mainz, Germany. No, it is in Mainz, near Frankfurt. And my husband's grandfather, Lessing Rosenwald, is a very famous book collector. And he has a whole collection in the Library of Congress. And he was fascinated with not only type, but different kinds of illustrations, you know, whether it's engraving or, you know, all the different ways that you can take to print illustrations. And so it's a subject we spent a lot of time on. But I think that this book, Just My Type, is like a essential thing if you're at all interested in it. I'm sure it's out in paperback now because the hardcover came out years ago.
Definitely. I was going to ask you guys, have you about cover designs, have you come across a design where it's like this shouldn't work, but it's so brilliant that it really kind of breaks all the rules, yet still works?
Well, I can't think of a specific example, but I feel like if it works, whether it's breaking the rules
Right,
or
right,
not,
right.
like if it works, it works.
Right.
You know?
Working is the rule.
Working is the rule, exactly. Okay.
Yeah, no matter how you get there, if it and again, I have always sensed that when everyone understands what the book is and then the right cover comes in, there's no question, like there's this electric charge that goes in the room. The room is rarely divided over a great cover.
And we're not even talking about titles, but if you really want to have fun, you can find collections where books that we are familiar with by their titles, we get to see the history of the evolution of the title, and some of them are just so sucky. You think there's surely they were never going to call the book that.
Right.
And then Copperheads prevailed or whatever it might be. But titles go through evolutions just like covers.
Yeah. Well, and a good title can really help the cover a lot too.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the title winds up making up like a third of the cover,
Yeah.
if not half of it in terms of cover real estate.
Yeah, these days more than ever, I feel like the titles have just become enormous. And
Yeah.
I
So, a good
heard, I don't
question.
know if this is true, but I've heard that it's because people are looking at their phones.
Mhm.
Like you used to see, like in the newspaper, they would print the book jacket and it would be like a couple inches,
Yeah.
big. And now people see these thumbnails on their phone, so they want the titles to be like gigantic.
And you can also tell when an author is rising in fame, because very often in like a first novel, you'll see the title is large and the author's name is small.
Yep.
And then eventually the title, the author's name takes up the entire front of the book almost, and the title is kind of right.
Look at Grady Hendrix there. His name's not that tiny anymore. It's
Yeah, I know. Well,
Yeah.
and I hate it because it gets in the way. I'm like, I want I want more image. I want, less of that. I mean, there's an argument to be made. Stephen King doesn't need cover illustrations anymore. You just say a new book by Stephen King. You just sold a couple 100,000 copies.
That's true.
Just getting a text from PK, who's trying to start his book discussion group.
Okay, well, tell him he has to wait a few minutes.
You gotta wait a few minutes, PK. There's a question from Edward who would like to know, and I was thinking about this too. It says, Grady and Jason, you've worked together so much. Have you thought of collaborating as authors on a novel together?
We've never talked about that.
Never talked about it. I mean, my thing is, it's funny. I like having an editor. I think I really like the back and forth. And I can't think of a single book I've ever written, and the majority of them were written with you as my editor, that aren't better for the editorial process. I mean, when we did My Best Friend's Exorcism, that was a wildly different book. And, I to this day wish I'd been the writer who could pull off the book I wanted to do, but I couldn't. And the book we could pull off was the one we wound up doing. And it was 100% the right book. It was just like, I feel like as a writer, you get fixated on these things you want to try and experimental structures and all this stuff. And I think, your real gift as an editor was you really kept it basic and down to story and character, which is kind of what readers want.
Yeah, I don't know that I could collaborate with another writer. I know people do it all the time, but I don't understand how. I just don't know. I don't know that I would like that, like with anybody. But I love.
We had a very interesting program last night with a brother and sister who have written and Boyd Morrison previously had written with Clive Cussler, but they love the collaborative process and they do a very good job explaining it. So if you're interested, you can watch the video for Boyd and Beth Morrison that we did last night. It's on our Facebook page. And the thing she most clearly, because she's the new one to writing, dwelt upon was the respect they had for each other, that you have to be respectful in order to collaborate. It can't be a dissing process or anything. You have to really pay attention to the other person's ideas and contributions. And I think that's a hard thing to negotiate. I was particularly interested that a brother and sister were able to do that so well.
Yeah, they must have got along pretty well.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I was talking to someone and there's a screenwriting partnership. And they were saying the hardest thing is these guys' scripts always come in way too long. They're like 140 pages, 150, and the screenplay's got to be 120 max. And they both started writing some screenplays on their own. And they're like, oh my God, these scripts are so tight. They're 90 pages. And so they were talking to them and they were like, well, I don't want to hurt his feelings and tell him I really didn't like that idea. So we keep it in.
Yeah.
And then you
Anything
got to
else,
split the
Patrick?
advance. There's always that pesky splitting the advance part. Who wants to do that, right?
All right.
That too.
Let's see. No, I don't think so.
All right. Well, Grady, we'll let you get back to your deadline, but thank you so
Yeah.
much for taking time to join us. This has really been a wonderful conversation. We went into places we don't normally get to. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about wonderful stuff like covers and designs and collaborations and whatever. We do have autographed copies of Hidden Pictures with Jason's special stamp on the title page. We might even eventually create a new cover for it. I'm going to think about that because
That's a cool idea.
I
I gotta
got
say.
that red cover in my head. I think it's so wonderful. Anyway, what a pleasure it has been to meet both of you. Thank you for spending time with us this evening.
Thanks, Barbara. This
Thank
is
you.
a lot of fun.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Patrick.
Night, everybody.
Good night, y'all.
Great.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.